The 1/4 loyal North Lancashire were losing 41 men a fortnight to rotting feet. Not to the German guns, to the water in their boots. And on a Tuesday morning in the first week of August 1917, a Liverpool plumber called Sergeant Beasley walked up the duckboard track from the Friesenberg support trench with a brass ruler in his pocket and told them he was going to fix it. They did not cheer him. They watched him from the fire step of a flooded communication trench called Friesenberg Support in the Friesenberg sector of the Ypres Salient, and what they thought of him would not have flattered a Liverpool plumber. He had taken 3 days and 2 nights of their working party labour, 400 sandbags they had hoped to use on the parapet, and the last of the brigade's stockpile of red Norwegian pine duckboards. In exchange, he had given them a path that ran at a strange angle and disappeared every 20 yards into a stone-lined hole that the men called, with the precise contempt of cold, hungry infantry, the sergeant's lavatory. The path was 6 inches lower at one end than at the other. They had measured it themselves, in disbelief, because no track in the Salient was ever level, and you measured a slope only if you thought there was something wrong with it. Beasley did not explain the 6 inches to them, or the holes, or why he had drained the water away from the parapet rather than toward it. He stood at the head of the track with a brass ruler in his right hand and a pencil stub behind his ear, and watched a German aeroplane cross the sky toward Westhook. And when the men of the 1st Fourth finally went up the line that evening, 3 of them came past him single file, and one of them said, not quite under his breath, "Sergeant, you'll have us drowning the proper way." Beasley did not answer. He had been a plumber in Toxteth before the war, and before that he had been an apprentice to a Manchester drainage foreman whose name was William Topham, and William Topham had once told him, in a backyard in Hume, on a wet October afternoon in 1908, that water had all the time in the world. He had said it the way another man might have said that gravity was downward, or that a brick weighed more than a sparrow, and Beasley had heard the sentence with his whole face. 9 years later, on the duckboard track at Friesenberg Support, he was still listening to it. I'm not certain about the date of that Toxteth posting, or the exact spelling of Topham's name. The records of the Manchester Corporation Drainage Department for those years are incomplete and were partly destroyed in a basement flood at the town hall in 1947, which is the kind of irony Beasley would have appreciated if he had lived to hear about it. What is certain, what is in the war diary of the Royal Engineers Field Company attached to the brigade in the Public Records Office at Kew under reference W095, is that on the 2nd of August 1917, Sergeant J.F. Beasley, sapper-fitter, was ordered to walk down the Friesenberg communication trench with a major of the Royal Engineers and to find out why the Lancashires were coming back from the front line with their feet wrapped in sandbags soaked in whale oil, why the regulation duckboard track was floating, and why the divisional medical officer had threatened to pull the battalion out of the line if the rate of evacuation for what the medical officer's office called trench foot advanced did not drop below 8 in 100 men inside 7 days. The major's name was Major Reginald Cawthorne. He had been a quarry engineer in pre-war Lancashire and was, in the unforgiving slang of the Royal Engineers in 1917, a chalk man, which is to say, he understood drainage in a country where water disappeared downward, and he was finding Flanders very hard. He walked the trench with Beasley for 40 minutes that morning and said almost nothing. The smell from the men's boots was somewhere between a butcher's bin in July and the wet end of an old wool mill, and the major's expression did not change at any point. When they reached the junction with the forward line, he stopped, put his back against a revetment of timber that was leaning 8 degrees out of true, and looked at Beasley as though Beasley were the answer to an arithmetic problem he had been carrying since the previous winter. "Sergeant," he said, "fix the wet." Beasley said, "Yes, sir." I do not particularly mind how you do it. I mind that the medical officer does not pull this battalion." He looked along the trench in the direction of the German wire. "If he pulls them, the brigade pulls us. If the brigade pulls us, the corps pulls the divisional engineers. If the corps pulls the divisional engineers, you and I are digging latrines in Poppering for the rest of the war. Fix the wet." That was the brief. Beasley had it in writing within the hour, on a chit of telegram paper, signed by the major and countersigned by the company adjutant, and he had a working party of 14 men assigned to him from the 1st, 4th Loyal North Lancashire, on the recommendation of their second-in-command, Captain G.R. Halliwell, a Bolton solicitor in civilian life, who took the view that a sapper at work was a sapper not to be argued with. Halliwell sent Beasley the men he could spare and 20 minutes of his own time in his dugout at battalion headquarters with a mug of black tea and a folded trench map. "Sergeant," Halliwell said, "I have lost 41 men this fortnight to feet. 41. He tapped the map twice with 2 fingers in the precise way Beasley had learned to read in officers who were not panicking and would not. "I am told they will not be replaced before the next show. I am also told that the next show is in about 3 weeks, give or take a barometric pressure. I would like to take more than half a rifle company over the start line. Can you make my duckboards drain?" Beasley said, "Yes, sir, if I am allowed to do it the way I learned in Toxteth, and not the way it is laid down in the field service pocketbook." Halliwell looked at him for 1 beat longer than was comfortable. "Sergeant," he said, "I do not own a field service pocketbook at the moment. I burned mine for warmth in a dugout outside Ypres in July. Make the duckboards drain." The Loyal North Lancashire, the 4th Battalion of the regiment, the territorial battalion that had been raised in Preston in August 1914 and that had been in France since the spring of 1915, held that morning a stretch of communication trench and a length of front line roughly 900 yards long, running from a smashed brick farm called Mousetrap to a half-buried pillbox the men called the Tin Hat. The ground beneath them was the Belgian blue clay that I would, much later in life, see for myself when I walked the Salient in the company of a Canadian park warden in the spring of 2009. The clay is heavy and waxy, and grey-blue when it is wet, and grey-white when it is dry, and it does not, in any meaningful sense, drain. The water sits on top of it like soup on a plate. A trench cut into Belgian blue clay in August fills with its own seepage in about 11 hours, and a duckboard track laid across the bottom of that trench floats on whatever rises through the gaps. The men of the 4th had been in and out of that line for a fortnight. Their boots, by the time they came down to the support trench, were not boots in any sense their mothers in Preston or Bootle or Burnley would have recognised. They were brown tubes of leather that had been wet for a week. The skin inside them was white and crinkled, like the skin of a chicken left to soak too long in salted water. In the worst cases, and there were many of these, by the morning of the 2nd of August, the skin was no longer white, but a sort of duck's egg grey, with red patches along the toe joints and a smell that Beasley had encountered before, exactly once, when he had been called in to a Toxteth flat in 1911 to clear a drain that turned out to contain the body of a small dog. He recognised the smell on the morning he walked the line with Major Cawthorne, and he stopped walking for half a second when he did, and then he started again, because he had work to do. Trench foot, and this is the part I would ask anybody who watches this to take seriously, because the schoolbooks get it wrong by a wide mile, is not frostbite. It is not, in any honest sense, even a cold weather injury. It is a wet immersion injury. A man's foot can be at 8 degrees centigrade above freezing in a sodden boot for 18 hours, and the small blood vessels in the foot will begin to behave as though the foot were frostbitten. The capillaries collapse. The tissue starves of oxygen. The skin begins to die from the outside in, but very slowly, the way a kitchen apple goes brown from a bruise, rather than the way a finger turns black in a January wind. And because it is slow, and because the man wearing the boot still has feeling in the foot for the first several days, he does not, generally speaking, report it. He does what every infantryman has done since the Pharaohs. He keeps walking on it until he cannot. By the time he cannot, the damage is done. Of the 41 men Halliwell had lost in that fortnight, 11 would never wear boots again. 3 would lose the foot at the ankle by Christmas. 1, a private of 19 named Albert Crouch of Bootle, formerly of the Liverpool docks, would lose both. I will come back to Crouch later, because he was on Beasley's working party that first day, and because his mother in Bootle wrote him a letter that reached the support line in the second week of August, and because Beasley read the letter aloud to him in a dugout one night under the wrong sort of lamp, and the letter said something very simple that any mother would have said, and that I have not, in 28 years of writing about this war, been able to forget. The point I am making, the point that the senior medical officer of the 55th West Lancashire Division was making, in less generous language, in his August dispatch to the divisional ADMS, was that Trenchfoot in August 1917, in the Ypres Salient, was a worse killer of fighting strength than the German artillery. The German artillery, terrible as it was, killed and wounded and sent down to the casualty clearing stations a definite, countable number of men. Trenchfoot did something stranger and slower. It thinned a battalion the way a leak under a kitchen sink thins a floorboard. Invisibly, continuously, until one day the floorboard collapses under your weight, and you understand that the leak has been at it for half a year. It was Beasley's job, that August, to find the leak, and it was Beasley's belief, walking back from the line with Major Cawthorne, that the leak was not, in any useful sense, in the men's boots. The leak was in the duckboard track itself, and behind the duckboard track, in the way the British Army had been taught to lay drainage in 1914. He thought about William Topham's sentence, in the backyard in Hume, all the way back to the company dugout. He sat on an ammunition box outside the dugout in the late afternoon. A thin August rain had begun to come down, the way it would come down for most of the next 11 weeks in that salient, and he took out his brass ruler. The ruler was stamped, on the back, with the words, Toxteth Borough Drainage, in small block capitals. His wife had bought it for him on his 24th birthday in 1912, second-hand, from a junk shop in Lord Street. He had carried it through every mile of the war. He set it on his knee. He drew a line on the back of a field message book in pencil. He drew a second line, 6 inches lower at the far end. He drew a third line, in the shape of a small square hole, 20 inches deep, on the lower edge of the second line. Then he drew another small square hole, 20 yards further along, and another, and another. In the original Field Service pocketbook for the Royal Engineers, in the edition then current, the 1914 edition, with the November 1916 amendments inserted by a clerical sergeant at Chatham, which I have seen for myself in the regimental library, the drainage gradient for a trench duckboard track was given as 1 in 200. That is to say, 1 inch of fall for every 200 inches of run. The figure had been arrived at, originally, by a board of engineer officers working in the chalk downs of Salisbury Plain in the autumn of 1912. It had been laid down for a country in which water drained downward through the chalk, and where the trench, in any practical sense, was a temporary feature. The figure had been carried over into Flanders without amendment, because the Royal Engineers of 1914 had been preparing, in their pocketbook, for a war of movement, and the war of movement had ended on the Aisne in September of that year, and nobody had thought to rewrite the chapter on drainage gradients to account for the fact that the men were going to be standing in those trenches in Flanders blue clay for the next 4 years. Beasley had seen the figure in 1915 on his sapper's course at Chatham. He had seen it on a chart pinned to the wall of a hut, and he had remembered Topham's sentence, and he had not said anything to the instructor, because he had been a corporal and the instructor had been a major. But he had thought, sitting in the back row of the hut with the rain on the corrugated iron roof, that whoever had laid down the figure 1 in 200 had never tried to drain a Toxteth backyard in November. A 1 in 200 gradient, in chalk, will draw water away. In blue clay it will not. The water will sit. It will sit in the duckboard track for as long as the rain falls, and longer, because the clay underneath will weep its own water upward through the gaps in the boards, and the men walking on the track will press the boards down into the clay and bring the water up through the joints, and the boards will be a foot under the water by the third day, and the men will be a foot under the water for as long as they are on the boards, and their feet, inside their boots, will be wet for as long as that, and the boots will not dry on the line because there are no dry boots on the line, only less wet ones. Beasley drew, on the back of his field message book, a gradient of 1 in 100. He drew beside it a small notation in his own shorthand, the same shorthand he had used in Toxteth, that said simply, Step Sump 20Y. Then he closed the book and put it in his breast pocket, beside a photograph of his wife Edith and a folded postcard from the previous Christmas, and he stood up, and he went to find Captain Halliwell to ask for 14 men, 400 sandbags, and the last of the stockpiled duckboards. It was, as you have heard, a request that did not make him popular. The German guns at Westhook began their afternoon shoot at 23 minutes past 4 on the 2nd of August 1917, and they continued with one short break for the regrouping of their forward observers until 6:45 in the evening. Beasley was on the support trench track when the first ranging round came over. He counted 3 seconds between the whistle and the thump and judged it a 5-9, falling about 120 yards to the southeast of his position on the brigade transport track behind Frasenberg. He went on counting. 5-9, 5-9, then a battery shift to 4-2s, falling forward of Mousetrap and walking along the front line as if a man with a long stick were tapping out a tune on the wet ground. He kept moving. A sapper fitter on a working day did not stop for a shoot unless the shoot was on his position, and this one was not yet, and even if it had been, there was nothing to do but get into a saphead and wait. He stepped over a runner who was lying flat in the bottom of the trench with his hands over his ears, and he went along the line, measuring the depth of standing water against the chalk line he had cut into the heel of his right ammunition boot, 1/4 of an inch for every notch, and he counted 43 inches of water in a 42-inch trench at the worst of the bays, which is to say that the men, when they came back down, would be walking through water above their knees. The shoot stopped. The runner uncurled himself. Beasley went back to the company dugout and found that a captain of the Royal Army Medical Corps had been waiting for him for half an hour, in the close steam of the dugout, with his belt unbuckled and a mug of coffee in his hand. The captain's name was Henderson, and he had been the divisional ADMS's representative for the Western Brigade front for 19 days, and he had the unsteady patience of a man who had not slept for 40 hours. "Sergeant Beasley," Henderson said, "I am told you have a plan." "I have a drawing, sir," Beasley said, "and, by the Major's leave, 14 men and 400 sandbags." "How long?" "To put down the first 100 yards, 3 days if it does not rain at night." "It will rain at night?" "Yes, sir." "How long if it rains at night?" 5 days, sir." Henderson set his coffee down on the dugout table and pulled a folded paper out of his tunic pocket. The paper had a printed grid on one side and a column of penciled figures down the other side, and the figures were not encouraging. Henderson laid the paper on the table between them and turned it with 2 fingers so that Beasley could read the column the right way up. 41 evacuations from this battalion in 14 days, Sergeant. 6 in 100. The threshold at which I notify the brigade Q is 8 in 100. The threshold at which I write to the Corps ADMS recommending the battalion be pulled is 12 in 100. We are at 6. The Corps is preparing, and you have not heard this from me, you have heard nothing. The first phase of the next divisional show in not less than 17 days and not more than 23. If this battalion is at 12 in 100 when the show goes in, the battalion does not go over the top, and we do not have replacements. 5-day estimate is too long, Sergeant. 3 days is barely all right. 2 days would be a small miracle. Can you do 2? No, sir. Henderson looked up at him. His eyebrows were sandy. His left eyelid was twitching very slightly, the way an instrument needle twitches when a current is being applied at the back of the dial. Can you do 3 then? Yes, sir. 3 days, with the men and the boards and the sandbags I've been promised, and one further thing. What further thing? 2 cubic yards of gravel, sir. Filter gravel. 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch grade. From the railway siding at Vlamerting that was shelled on Sunday. I went past it on the road up. There is a stockpile under a tarpaulin on the north side of the siding, dropped by the Belgian narrow-gauge people in June. I would like permission to take 2 yards of it and a stretcher party with strong arms to carry it forward. Henderson stared at him for 2 seconds. Then he laughed once, a short, hard laugh that he plainly had not used for some time. He picked up his coffee, drank the rest of it in one swallow, and put the mug back down. "Sergeant," he said, "take 3 yards. Take 5 if you can carry it. I will sign the chit before I leave this dugout. If you can drop my evacuation rate below 4 in 100 by the 23rd of August, I will personally walk down to the brigade and recommend you for the military medal. If you cannot, I will personally walk down to the brigade and have you posted to the Divisional Pioneer Battalion, where you will spend the rest of the war making latrines for staff officers in Poppering. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Get the gravel." He signed the chit. He buckled his belt. He went back up the duckboard track toward brigade in the rising evening shoot. Beasley folded the chit into the breast pocket of his tunic, on top of the photograph of Edith and the postcard from the previous Christmas. He sat down on the ammunition box outside the dugout. He took out the field message book and the brass ruler, and he began, with a pencil stub from behind his ear, to set out the cubic yardage of gravel he would actually need, and the carrying parties he would actually require, and the time it would actually take, in a hand that he had inherited from William Topham, and that was, by the standards of any drainage office in the north of England, as neat as a hymn tune. The carrying parties came up at 8 in the evening. They were drawn from a working detail of the 1st 4th Loyal North Lancashire, under Lance Sergeant Wilkinson, a Preston man of about 30 who had been an apprentice cabinet maker before the war, and who treated all standing orders with the polite contempt of a craftsman who had seen worse jobs. Wilkinson assembled his 14 men in a half-circle at the head of the support trench. They came up out of the bays, one by one, with their rifles slung muzzle down for the wet, their faces under the brim of the Brodie helmet shadowed and tired, and they stood in the half-circle and did not speak, and looked at Sergeant Beasley with the flat, patient expression of men who have been promised, by a great many strangers in great many uniforms, a great many things that have not happened. One of them was Private Albert Crouch. I have said that I would come back to Crouch, and now I do. He was 19 years old on the 2nd of August 1917, and he had enlisted in Liverpool in the recruiting office on William Brown Street in mid-September 1916, a few days after his 18th birthday, and a few days after the death of his uncle at the Battle of Ginchy on the Somme. His uncle, Stephen Crouch, had been a docker at the Huskisson Dock and a corporal in the King's Liverpool Regiment, and he had been the man, more than his own father, who had taught Albert how to read a tide table and how to splice a hemp rope and how to behave around foremen who drank. Albert had gone down to the recruiting office that morning with the telegram still in his pocket. The recruiting sergeant had not looked at the telegram, but he had looked at Albert, and at his hands, which were the hands of a man 6 years older than 19, and had passed him through the medical with a wink and a nod, and a half-smile that, 23 months later, in a casualty clearing station outside Bosing, Albert would still not have entirely understood. He stood in the half-circle now with his rifle slung. He was 5'9" and very thin. He had a long, flat face like a Yorkshire stoat, and a slow, soft, bootle accent, and a habit, when he was concentrating, of touching the lobe of his left ear with his right thumb. He could not, the war diary records, read or write. He had given his next of kin, when asked at the recruiting office, as Mrs. Mary Crouch, of 17 Stanley Road, Bootle, in the unsteady block letter print of a man writing for the first time the surname of his own mother. The recruiting clerk had corrected the spelling on the second line and let Albert sign his name as a cross. Mrs. Mary Crouch was 46 years old in August 1917. She had borne 5 children, of whom 3 lived. She worked, in the war, on the night shift of the match factory at Litherland, a mile up the Mersey from Stanley Road. She had been writing to her son Albert at the rate of 1 letter every 9 days since he had landed in France in April. The letters were dictated to a younger neighbour, a school leaver of 14 named Sarah Riley, who lived 3 doors up and who could, the school inspector had said, write a fair copying hand, and they were posted at the corner of Stanley Road on the Tuesday morning collection. They reached Albert in France, on average, 11 to 14 days after she sent them. He received them at the company dugout and gave them unopened to Wilkinson, who read them aloud to him in a corner of the dugout in the quietest minute of the evening that Wilkinson could find. The letter that reached Albert at Friesenberg Support on the morning of the 12th of August 1917 had been sent from Bootle on the 31st of July. It had crossed the Channel on the 2nd of August in the same mail sack as the orders that had brought Major Cawthorne to the company line. It came up the support trench in the same sandbag as Beasley's gravel chit from Henderson. It said, I am quoting from a transcript made many years later by the Imperial War Museum when the Crouch family deposited the letter, and the transcript is in the collection under reference Documents 4471. It said, My dearest Albert, Sarah is writing for me again, as my eyes have not been good this week. Mrs. Maguire from next door has had a letter from her son Joseph, who is at a place called Ypres, and she says it is wet. Sarah looked it up at the Free Library, and it is the same place where you are by the look of it. Albert, please keep your feet dry, son. I always told you that when you were at the docks, and your father told you that too. Wet feet is no joke. Your father lost his big toe to wet feet on the Cunard line in 1903, and he was never the same man after it. Please, son, keep your feet dry. I love you, Mother. It was a letter that any mother in any country might have written to any son in any war. It was a letter that Beasley, who did not know Albert Crouch at all, would not have read at any other time in his life. It was a letter that, 2 nights later, in the dugout at Friesenberg Support, under the wrong sort of paraffin lamp, on the 3rd night of the work, Beasley read aloud to Albert because Wilkinson was up on the line and there was no other man in the dugout who could. I will come to that night in its place. For now, for the half-circle on the evening of the 2nd of August, Albert Crouch stood in the back row of the working party with his rifle slung and looked at Sergeant Beasley with the flat, patient expression that the rest of the men carried, and listened to the orders. The orders, in the Royal Engineers' shorthand of the working day, were as follows. Track to be lifted, in 50-yard sections, beginning at the support junction. Existing duckboards to be set aside, but not used again. Cut and shape new duckboards from the Norwegian pine stockpile to a standard 4x3 plank dimension. Lay fascines of brushwood under the new boards, 2 layers, cross-laid, at every 20 yards exactly, by surveyor's tape. Beasley had brought up a 30-yard tape, lent by the company adjutant. Excavate a sump 3 feet deep by 2 feet square, with a stepped lower chamber 4 inches lower than the upper, lined with sandbags and bottomed with 2 inches of the Lavatory filter gravel. "You'll be digging holes in your own duckboard, Sergeant?" Wilkinson asked, in the careful voice of a man who is not yet ready to disbelieve, but is preparing to. "That's right, Sergeant," Beasley said.
"And the water will go into the holes?"
"That's right." "And then where will the water go?" Beasley looked at him for one beat and saw that Wilkinson was not asking ironically. He was asking, in good faith, the question that any cabinet maker would ask. Where does the joint go? Where is the load? Where is the failure plane? Beasley took out the field message book and turned to the back page and held the page up to the light of the dugout lantern. "Into the next sump," he said, "and then the next one. Each sump is 4 inches lower than the last. The whole line falls 1 in 100 over its length. The water moves itself. Without a pump. Without a pump." "Sergeant," Wilkinson said slowly, "I was an apprentice cabinet maker. I am not an engineer, but I have laid a kitchen floor in my mother's house in Preston, and the floor sloped 1 in 200 to the door, and that was, the joiner said, the steepest you wanted, because much more than that, and you could not stand a teacup on the table. 1 in 100, in a trench. Sergeant, the men will fall over." "They will not," Beasley said. "It is 6 inches over 20 yards. You will not feel it under your boots." Wilkinson was quiet. "And the man with the cup of tea," Wilkinson said, "in the section bay." "The duckboard does not run through the bay, Sergeant. The duckboard runs along the trench. The bay floor is separate. The bay floor will be level. The drainage is in the connecting run." Wilkinson considered this for one long moment, with the quiet attention of a craftsman receiving an unfamiliar set of plans. And then he turned to his 14 men, and he said, in the voice of a Preston working man speaking to other Preston, Bootle and Burnley working men, "Lads, Sergeant Beasley wants to dig drains in the floor of his own track. He says the water will move itself. He has a brass ruler from Toxteth and a field message book and a chit from the medical officer for 3 yards of gravel. I think he is going to do it. I think we are going to help him. Albert, you and I will start on the first sump. Get a shovel." Albert Crouch said, "Right, Sarge," and stepped out of the half-circle and went to find a shovel. That was the start of the work. The first night was the worst. The German guns came back at 9:30, and they walked their fire down the brigade transport track and onto the support line for 45 minutes, and the working party went to ground 3 times in the first hour. The Lavatory gravel arrived at the head of the support trench at 11:15, in 2 stretchers carried by 4 men of the Divisional Pioneer Battalion, and the load was lighter than Beasley had hoped, perhaps 1.5 yards rather than 3, but it was, when Beasley took a handful out of the bag and rubbed it between his fingers, the right gravel. 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch grade. Clean, well graded, the kind of gravel that, in a Toxteth backyard in 1909, would have got a nod from William Topham and no further comment. By dawn on the 3rd of August, the first 50 yards of the new track had been lifted. The first 3 sumps had been dug. The first sump had been gravelled and sandbag lined, and was, in Beasley's careful pencil notation in the field message book, running clear. Wilkinson stood at the head of the new track in the grey light, with his cap pushed back and a mug of coffee in his hand, and watched the water move in a way he had not, the night before, believed water could move, from the second sump along the 4-inch fall and into the third sump, and out of the third sump by a small lateral drain Beasley had cut in the wall, into a parados channel that took it back, by gravity alone, into the old shell crater pond behind the line. Wilkinson watched for 2 minutes. He put down his mug. He said, to nobody in particular, "Bloody hell." And then he went back to work. On the 4th of August, the working party laid 60 yards of track. On the 5th, 80. On the 6th, the day before the small evening on which Beasley read Mrs. Crouch's letter aloud to her son, the party laid 95 yards, and the first 120 yards of the new line stood, in the heaviest rain the Salient had seen since the previous October, with no standing water on its surface. The men of the 1st 4th, coming down off the line on the morning of the 6th, stepped onto the new track in their wet boots and stopped, 3 of them in a row, and looked down at the boards, which were not floating, and one of them, a Burnley man named Holdsworth, who had a broken front tooth and an opinion on every question, said to the man behind him, "Christ, Mick, the sergeant's bloody track's bloody dry." He did not say it to Beasley, who was at the far end of the line marking out the next sump. But the men of the 1st 4th began, from the morning of the 6th of August onward, to refer to the new line, without irony and without affection, but without contempt, as Beasley's path. It was, in its way, the closest thing to a cheer the men gave him. The work was not finished. The work was 300 yards out of a planned 900, and the rain was coming, and the German guns were still ranging onto the support line every afternoon, and Captain Henderson had not yet been back to make his second count of feet. The evacuations for the week ending the 6th of August were 16, not down from the previous fortnight's 21, but not up, and the threshold for the medical officer's note to brigade was 8 in 100 per week, which the battalion was, by the count, just over. It was on the evening of the 7th of August, in the dugout at the head of the support trench, with the rain coming down through the corrugated iron roof in a steady drip, and Wilkinson up on the line, supervising the night working party, that Beasley read Mrs. Crouch's letter aloud to Albert Crouch by the light of a paraffin lamp that was running low on oil and casting more shadow than light. The lamp was, and this is the kind of detail my grandfather, who had been a Royal Engineers sergeant himself in the Second War, used to insist mattered, an Albion pattern trench lamp with the wick set too low, because the rationing of paraffin in the Second Army area had been tightened in late July, and the lamps were being run lean to last out the storm fortnight. Beasley turned up the wick a quarter turn, set the lamp on the dugout table, and unfolded the letter from the brown paper sleeve in which Wilkinson had been keeping it. He read slowly. He read the part about Sarah and the eyes, and Mrs. Maguire and the wet. He read the part about the Cunard line and the big toe. He read the last 3 sentences without speeding up, because William Topham had once told him, in the backyard at Hume, that the reading of a letter aloud was not a job to be hurried. "Please, son, keep your feet dry. I love you, Mother." Albert Crouch sat on the dugout floor, with his back against a stack of sandbags, his right thumb against the lobe of his left ear, his eyes fixed on the candle shadow of the lamp on the rough plank wall. When Beasley had finished, he did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Sarge, could you read the bit about Mrs. Maguire again?" Beasley read the bit about Mrs. Maguire again. Then Albert Crouch said, "Thank you, Sarge. Could I have the letter, please?" Beasley folded the letter carefully along the original creases and held it out. Albert took it and put it inside the breast pocket of his tunic, against the worn cardboard sleeve in which he kept his paybook and a small, unframed photograph of a black and white terrier dog that had belonged, before the war, to his Uncle Stephen. He sat there for another moment, then he said, "Sarge?" "Yes, lad." "I'll be on the night shift again tonight." "Yes, lad." "I'll keep at it." "Good lad." Albert Crouch stood up, took his rifle from where it was leaning against the dugout wall, and went out into the rain, up the new duckboard track that did not float, toward the night shift on the 8th sump. I have, in the years since I first read the Crouch deposition at the Imperial War Museum, gone back over the Beasley War Diary entries for that week 3 times. I have crossed the dates against the company's working party rosters and against the medical officer's running tally of evacuations. I have stood on the ground where the support trench ran, in May 2009 and again in October 2012, with a Belgian battlefield archaeologist whose name I have agreed not to publish because the family that owns the field still farms it and prefers to be left in peace. I have, in short, done what I can do to know what happened next. What happened next was, in any honest reading, a small miracle in part and a slow catastrophe in part, and Beasley, who was the engineer of one and could not have been the engineer of the other, lived afterwards with both. The miracle is the easier story to tell. The catastrophe is the one that mattered. The first 300 yards of the new track were finished on the 9th of August. The next 300, from the junction of Fresenberg Support to the forward bay called the Tin Hat, were finished, against everything the divisional engineers had said was possible, by the evening of the 14th. The German afternoon shoot ranged onto the line twice in those 5 days, but the shoots were short, and the working parties got into the bays in time, and there were no casualties among Beasley's party. By the evening of the 15th of August, the new line ran the full 900 yards from the support junction to the forward bay. It fell 1 inch in 100. It had 36 stepped sumps. It was, by any standard then in print, or out of print in the Royal Engineers of 1917, an absurd line. It was also, on the morning of the 16th, when the heaviest rain the Salient had seen in 3 months came down, the only line in the brigade front that was not under standing water. Captain Henderson came up on the 17th. He walked the line for an hour. He stopped at the 16th sump, the one Wilkinson had personally helped Albert Crouch dig in the small hours of the 3rd of August, and crouched on his heels, in the wet, and looked at the way the water was moving in the small lateral drain, and stood up, and looked at Beasley, and said nothing at all for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "Sergeant Beasley, you have done a thing here." And then he went back down to brigade. The evacuations for the week ending the 20th of August were 9. For the week ending the 27th, 4. For the week ending the 3rd of September, by which time the second phase of the divisional show had gone in and come out again, 2. By the end of September, the rate for the battalion was at 2 4/10 in 100 per week, which is to say, below the threshold at which the medical officer notified the brigade, and below the threshold at which the brigade notified the corps, and below the threshold at which the corps notified the divisional engineers, and below the threshold at which Sergeant Beasley would have been sent to dig latrines in Poppering. The miracle, in the War Diary entries and the Imperial War Museum file and the medical officer's monthly returns and the eventual citation, looked like that. The catastrophe, the slow one, the one that mattered, looked like Albert Crouch. He was on the working party until the morning of the 11th of August. He was reassigned to his rifle section on the evening of that day in the standard rotation. He went up onto the front line on the night of the 11th. He came down off the line in the standard rotation on the morning of the 20th. He was, and this is in the company medical officer's notes, which I have read in the Lancashire Infantry Museum archives, in a handwritten register that has not, to my knowledge, ever been transcribed, passed at the morning foot inspection of the 20th as right foot, mild discoloration, painful on pressure, left foot advanced, mark for evacuation. He was put on the next ration cart back to the casualty clearing station at Brandhook. He was at Brandhook on the 22nd. He was at the base hospital at Ypres on the 25th. He was on a hospital ship to Dover on the 28th. He lost his left foot at the ankle joint in a theatre at the Liverpool Royal Infirmary on the 2nd of September. He lost his right foot at the ankle joint in the same theatre on the 11th of September. He was 19 years and 19 days old on the 2nd of September 1917, and he was 19 years and 28 days old on the 11th. His boots, the medical officer's notes recorded, had not been off his feet for 9 days before the morning of the 20th. The letter from his mother, the one Beasley had read aloud to him on the 7th of August, was still in the breast pocket of his tunic when he was undressed at Brandhook. It is in the Imperial War Museum, in the same file as the transcript I have already quoted from, in a small archival sleeve marked simply Crouch A 1/4LNL. I am telling this in the order in which Beasley learned it, because that is the order in which it bore on him. He learned that Crouch had been marked for evacuation on the 20th. He learned, on the 22nd, that Crouch was at Brandhook. He learned, on the 25th, that Crouch had gone to Ypres. He learned, on the 28th, that Crouch had gone home. He learned, by a letter from Mrs. Crouch herself, that reached him through the regimental orderly room on the 7th of October, and this letter is also in the IWM file, that Crouch had lost both feet. The letter was 3 lines long. It said, "Sergeant, my Albert told me what you done for the boy's feet. He said you read out my letter to him. Thank you for that. He has not got his feet now. God bless you. Mary Crouch." Beasley kept that letter in the same breast pocket as the photograph of Edith and the chit from Captain Henderson and the small folded postcard from the previous Christmas for the rest of the war and for some long stretch of the years afterward. The pocket was repaired, by Edith, with a small square patch of his own pre-war waistcoat lining in the winter of 1923 when the seam wore through. The letter was inside the pocket when she repaired it. He did not, the diary records, eat supper on the night of the 7th of October. He did not, the diary records, drink that night either. He sat in the dugout at the head of Beasley's path. The men had begun by then to call it that without any irony at all, and he set his field message book on the table in front of him, and he opened it to the back page where the original drawing of the gradient and the first sump was, and he drew, very carefully, in pencil, a small mark beside the figure 1 in 100. The mark was a tally, a single vertical stroke. The diary does not say what the tally was for, but I have my own view, which I will not press, about what the tally was for, and I will say only that there were, by the end of the war, 16 such marks in that book, and that the book is in the Royal Engineers Museum at Chatham, and that you may go and look at it any Tuesday afternoon if you write ahead. He did not, however, sit long. The next morning's working party was at 6. The line was not finished. There were 300 more yards to lay onto the new forward bay that the brigade had taken in the second phase, and the rain was, the meteorological summary for the 2nd Army area records, just beginning to come down in earnest, and there were the men of the 1st, 4th, loyal North Lancashire, still in the line and still wearing boots that, if they stayed dry, would carry them through the worst weeks of an October that the official history would later describe, in the dry sentences of a regimental officer with no inclination to dramatize, as the wettest the Salient had seen since the war began. The work for Beasley was not finished. It was, in fact, just getting going. A sump, in the drainage trade, as Beasley had learned it from William Topham in 1908, is not a hole. A hole is what a man with a shovel digs when he has decided that the water in the floor needs to go somewhere else and has no further plan. A sump is a hole that has been thought about. It has, in any properly built form, 3 parts. There is an upper chamber, which is the part the water enters first. There is a step, a small drop in the floor of the chamber, 4 or 5 or 6 inches, depending on the load, into a lower chamber, which is the part the water enters after the upper chamber has done its first work on it. And there is, between the upper chamber and the lower chamber, a layer of graded gravel, which the Edwardian textbooks called a filter bed, and which the men of the trade called, more honestly, the catch. The catch is the thing the schoolbooks miss. The reason a sump exists at all is not, as I have heard explained occasionally by retired officers who took up the writing of military history in their later years and who passed lightly over the drainage chapters because they had not had to dig the sumps themselves, to hold water. Holding water is the easiest task a sump performs and the least important one. Any hole in the ground will hold water for a few hours. The reason a sump exists, in the proper Edwardian municipal sense, is to slow the water down. The water enters the upper chamber moving with whatever momentum the line above has given it, carrying whatever silt and small organic matter it has picked up between the last sump and this one. If the water keeps moving when it leaves the sump, all the sump has done is move the problem along to the next point in the line. If the water slows down, which is what the step does, and what the graded gravel does, and what the lateral overflow on the far wall is built at the height it is built to do, the silt drops to the bottom of the lower chamber. The water leaves the sump clean. The next sump down the line, accordingly, receives clean water. The line stays open. The silt accumulates, predictably and on schedule, only in the lower chamber of the sump, and is cleared out by a working party once a week with a long-handled shovel. The catch is, in short, the small piece of patience the line builds into itself. The line gives the water something to do, a moment of stillness, a small invitation to drop its load, and the water, which has all the time in the world, accepts the invitation, because the water is not in a hurry and has never been in a hurry, and is only ever in a hurry because the man trying to drain it has built him a line that does not let him rest. This was the sentence behind Topham's sentence in the Hume backyard in 1908. It had taken Beasley 9 years to understand it as more than a saying. He understood it now, in the late summer of 1917, in a way he would not have been able to put into words if Wilkinson had asked him. The stepped sump, in the form Beasley laid down on Beasley's path in August and September 1917, was 3 feet deep and 2 feet square in plan. The upper chamber was 18 inches deep, with a sandbag-lined floor and a sandbag-lined back wall. The step was 4 inches. The lower chamber was 14 inches deep, lined on the floor with the Flammertinger filter gravel, 2 inches of it, well rolled with the heel of a boot. The far wall of the lower chamber had, set into it at the height of the step, a single short length of 2-inch galvanized pipe. Beasley had had to argue for the pipe and had got it, eventually, from a half-derelict pump house behind the brigade transport line, which served as the lateral overflow. The pipe took the cleaned water, by gravity alone, 4 feet sideways into a parados channel which carried it back, by a fall of about 1 in 75, into the old shell crater pond behind the support trench. The pond, by the 2nd week of August, was acting as the line's general settling reservoir, and was clear enough, on its surface, that you could see the wet brown leaves of the previous October still lying on the bottom of it. The duckboard above the sump was hinged. Beasley had cut and shaped the lid himself on the evening of the 3rd of August, on an ammunition box outside the company dugout, by the light of the same Albion lamp he had used to read Mrs. Crouch's letter on the 7th. The lid was 3 feet by 2, with a brass hinge on the upstream side. The brass had come from a section of a German signal cable conduit that had been salvaged from a shelled forward sap in July, and Beasley had filed it down by hand to fit, and a leather loop on the downstream side for a man to lift it with one finger. The lid sat flush with the rest of the duckboard track. A man walking up the line in the wet would not have known by his feet that there was a sump beneath him at all. Once a week, Wilkinson's working party lifted the lid, scooped out the silt from the lower chamber with the long-handled shovel. There was, Wilkinson reported with a quiet professional satisfaction, about 2 pints of fine clay sludge per sump per week, and put the lid back down. That was the sump. I have, when I have explained this work to engineering students at the Polytechnic, where my late wife's nephew teaches, drawn the cross-section on a blackboard exactly as Beasley drew it on the back of the field message book on the 2nd of August 1917. I have explained the step. I have explained the catch. I have explained the lateral pipe. I have always, at the end, made the same point. The sump in the Beasley line was a piece of Edwardian municipal drainage practice carried by one Liverpool plumber into the Ypres salient under the wrong conditions, and made to work because it had been understood by that plumber on its own terms and not as a piece of military doctrine. The Royal Engineers Journal of December 1917 carried, in its monthly section on fieldworks, an unsigned note about a drainage method recently observed in the Second Army area employing a stepped sump at intervals of 20 yards in conjunction with a 1 in 100 duckboard gradient. The note was 3 paragraphs long. It did not name Beasley because the journal in 1917 was reticent about the naming of non-commissioned officers in print. It did note, in its last sentence, and I quote from a copy of the issue in the library at the Royal Engineers Museum at Chatham, that the method, where rigorously applied, has produced a sustained reduction in the rate of evacuation for cold injury of the lower extremity and is commended to the attention of field companies in conditions of high water table and impermeable subsoil. The note was the first time anything written by an engineer about Beasley's work appeared in print. It was, in the form of recognition, the Royal Engineers gave to a Liverpool sergeant in 1917, the form they could give. Beasley did not see the note when it appeared. He saw it, eventually, in February 1919, in the Royal Engineers reading room at Chatham, where the bound volume of the 1917 journal was on a low shelf. He took the volume down. He read the note. He put the volume back on the shelf. He went and had a cup of tea in the canteen. The neighbours, in the working sense, the 1/8 King's Liverpool on the right of the quarter and the 1/4 King's Own on the left, watched the work go in from across their respective sector boundaries and did not, on the whole, understand it. The OC of the 1st 8th King's Liverpool, a Major Vaughan, who had been in the line since the spring of 1915 and who held the view that the Royal Engineers were a body of well-intentioned theorists, sent a runner across to Beasley on the morning of the 11th of August with a verbal message. The runner, a bootle man with 2 black eyebrows that nearly met in the middle, delivered the message in the careful, flat tone of a man who had been told to repeat the words exactly. "Sergeant, Major Vaughan's compliments. Major Vaughan says, your gradient is too steep, your sumps are too close together, and the men in the line will not be able to balance their tea. Major Vaughan asks if you would consider, in the interest of the brigade, lifting the line and putting it back at the regulation." Beasley listened without expression. He took the runner into the dugout, gave him a mug of tea, which the man drank standing because there was no second chair, and he wrote a reply in pencil on a chit of telegram paper. The reply was 4 lines long. Major Vaughan, with Sergeant Beasley's compliments. The gradient is 1 in 100. The fall is 6 inches in 20 yards. The fall is below the threshold at which a man feels the slope under his boots. A man can balance a cup of tea on the new track without spilling. I will personally demonstrate this on the brigade transport track at any time that suits the Major. Yours respectfully, J. F. Beasley, Sergeant. He folded the chit and gave it to the runner. The runner read the chit, looked at Beasley once, with what may have been amusement, or what may have been the careful, bootle suspension of judgment that a Mersey man employs when a Toxteth sergeant has said something he is not yet sure whether to take seriously, and went back across the brigade boundary at a steady walk. Major Vaughan did not, the war diary records, take Beasley up on the offer of a demonstration. He did, however, and this is also in the war diary, in a single dry sentence on the entry for the 23rd of August, request, through brigade, that 2 of Beasley's sappers be loaned to the 1st 8th King's Liverpool for the purpose of advising on a similar line in their own sector. The request was granted. The line went in. By the 2nd week of September, the 1/8th King's Liverpool were running their own Beasley sumps on the right of the brigade front, with a gradient that, after Major Vaughan had personally tested it for T-balance, was 1 in 110, a small Liverpudlian modification in the spirit of conciliation, but only a small one. I should say here, because it will matter later in this story, that the work was not, even after the 3rd week of August, easy. The rain came down in the Salient for 34 out of the next 45 days. The German artillery walked along the support line at irregular intervals. Never the same time, never the same battery, never the same caliber, and Wilkinson lost 2 men of his working party on the morning of the 29th of August to a single 5-9 that fell on the parados in the middle of a sandbag and gravel detail. The men were Privates Holman and Whittam. They were buried in the brigade cemetery at Flammertinger Military Cemetery, where they remain. The cemetery is open to visitors, and the headstones are, by the standards of the Salient cemeteries, well kept. I have stood in front of both of them. The dates are the dates. The plot references, Plot 5, Row F, Graves 11 and 12, are in the war diary and in the cemetery register and may be checked. The work went on. Beasley's path ran 900 yards by the 17th of August and 1,100 yards by the 3rd of September. The forward bay, called the Tin Hat, which had been, on the 2nd of August, 6 inches deep in standing water, was, by the end of August, dry to the duckboard. The men of the 1st 4th began to come back down off the line with feet that were wet only at the toes rather than to the calves, and a foot inspection at the company dugout on the 2nd of September showed, for the first time since the battalion had taken over the sector, no cases of advanced trench foot at all. I want to be honest with the viewer at this point, because the temptation in a story like this is to tell it in a single ascending line, to say, the engineer thought, the engineer built, the engineer solved. The story does not honestly run that way. The story has, in the middle of it, a particular afternoon that I want to describe, because it was the afternoon on which Beasley understood that he had got most of the answer right, and a small but important part of the answer wrong, and that the small wrong part had its own slow human cost. The afternoon was the 4th of September, 1917. The rain had come down without a serious break for 9 days, and the line had held. Beasley's path was, at that point, the only piece of the brigade front not under water, and Beasley, in the early afternoon, took the regular walk along the forward extension of the track to inspect the latest section of sumps. He was alone. Wilkinson was on rest behind the brigade transport line with most of the working party. The rain was thin and grey and steady. The track was, and Beasley noted this in the field message book at the time, with a small private satisfaction, running clear, with about 1/4 of an inch of water on the surface of the boards from the rainfall itself, but no standing water in the trench. He found Holdsworth, the Burnley man with the broken front tooth and the opinion on every question, sitting on a fire step at the 11th sump from the support junction. Holdsworth was eating, with the slow, careful attention of a man who has decided that the next bite is going to be the most important thing in the world for the next 20 seconds. The brown stickiness of a hard ration biscuit dipped in his mess tin tea. His rifle was beside him on the fire step, muzzle down for the wet. He looked up when Beasley came along the duckboard and nodded, the way men in line nodded to a sergeant they had decided was approximately on their side. "Sergeant." "Holdsworth?" "Bloody track holds, Sergeant." "It does?" "It does," Holdsworth said, agreeably, and went back to his biscuit. Beasley walked on. He had taken 3 further paces along the track when something, what he could not quite have said, made him turn around and come back. He came back to Holdsworth, and he stood for a moment looking down at him, and then he said, in the tone of a man who had not yet decided what he was about to ask, "Holdsworth, lad, when did you last have your boots off?" Holdsworth looked at him. "Sergeant, you mean off, or off with the puttees on?" Off. Holdsworth thought. He thought for what was, by any reasonable measure, too long. "Sergeant," he said eventually, "I had them off on the morning of the 2nd. We did the foot inspection. The 2nd was 2 days previously." "And the puttees? When did you last have the puttees off?" "Sergeant," Holdsworth said, and there was a small new note in his voice that Beasley had not heard from him before. "I have not had the puttees off since the morning of the 1st. The puttees have been wet, Sergeant. I thought it would be more bother than it was worth." "Take them off now, lad." "Sergeant." "Take them off, Holdsworth, now." Holdsworth set down his mess tin. He set down his biscuit, with care, on the inside of his upturned helmet, which was sitting on the fire step beside him. He unwound the putty from his right calf, slowly, because the wool was wet through and the wrap had begun to bind on itself, and then he eased off the right boot and the right sock, and the smell that came up off his foot in the wet afternoon air was the smell that Beasley had encountered exactly twice before in his life. Once in a Toxteth flat in 1911. Once on the morning of the 2nd of August on the support trench at Frasenburg. The foot was grey. Not the duck's egg grey of advanced trench foot in the cold weather form. The foot was grey along the inner side of the arch and along the heel. A slow, slack, faintly green grey, with red patches at the toe joints and a softness to the skin that, when Beasley pressed it with his thumb, did not spring back the way live tissue springs back, but kept the indentation for 3 or 4 seconds, as if it had been kneaded. Holdsworth was looking down at his own foot with the polite curiosity of a man inspecting a piece of unfamiliar machinery. "Sergeant," he said, "what is that?" "Lad," Beasley said, "that is trench foot. Early. Get your boot off the other foot now, slowly." The left foot was, when it came out of its boot, in a milder version of the same state. Both feet had been wet, and the word is not wet in the casual sense in which we use it of a man caught in a rainstorm, but wet in the sense that the putty had been holding moisture against the calf for 90 hours, and the sock had not been dry for nearly 3 days, for long enough that the capillaries along the inner foot had begun to do what capillaries do under those conditions. Holdsworth had not, on the duckboard track, been standing in water. The track was dry. The track was, on the morning of the 4th of September, the only stretch of brigade line that was dry. And his feet were going. Beasley sat down on the fire step beside Holdsworth and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, and the field message book records the substance of the next half hour in 3 lines of pencil shorthand, which I have, with the help of a curator at the Royal Engineers Museum, expanded into the longer passage I am giving you here. Beasley said, "Lad, the drains aren't the whole job, are they?" "Sergeant?" "The track is dry, but your puttees are wet. From the rain, from your sweat, from the mud you crouch in when you go up to the post. The boot doesn't dry on you, lad. The boot can't dry on you because the puttee is holding the water against the calf, and the wool of the sock is wicking the water down into the leather, and the leather can't breathe out faster than the wool wets it in. And the foot inside the boot is in a small swamp that the boot is carrying around with it. The line being dry under your boot, that doesn't fix the boot." Holdsworth was looking at him with the patient attention a man gives an officer who is talking to himself out loud and has not yet decided whether to include him in the conversation. "Right, Sergeant. You need to be able to take the boots off." "Yes, Sergeant." for half an hour at a time, in the line, without standing in water while you do it. Yes, Sergeant. You need a dry platform in the bay, off the floor of the bay, under cover, where you can sit on a fire step and put your bare feet down on dry wood and rub them dry with a square of dry hessian and put on a dry sock and then put the boot back on. Sergeant, there isn't no dry sock. Then we'll find dry socks. There's 120 of them at Brigade Transport that came up with the last ration carry. Wilkinson signed for the load. I'll get them moved up. 1 pair per man per 24 hours, rotated through a drying line in the support dugout. The drying line goes over the brazier. The brazier runs whether there's a ration cooker or not. That's a separate problem, and I'll deal with it. Lad, get your boots back on for now. Carefully, with the sock you have. He stood. He folded the field message book back into his breast pocket. He looked, very briefly, north along the duckboard track toward the front line, and then he looked south, back toward the support junction. The track was dry. The track had been dry for 9 days. The line, by the medical officer's count, was at 2 4/10 in 100 per week. And Holdsworth, who had stood on the dry track in dry weather for the last 9 days, had nevertheless got himself a foot that, if it had been ignored for 1 more week, would have cost him the toes. Beasley said, "Holdsworth, lad, stay off both feet for the rest of the watch. I'll send a stretcher up from the dugout. Don't argue. You are getting your boots off and your feet up, and you are going down to brigade tonight. Probably you will be back in 3 weeks with both feet still on you. If you stay here and walk on these for another 2 days, you will be back in Bootle next month, and you will be there for good. Don't argue. That's an order, lad." Holdsworth did not argue. By the 7th of September, Beasley had set out the second half of the line. The second half was not drainage. The second half was, and the war diary, in the entry for the 8th, refers to it as Sergeant Beasley's stand-down platforms, and the men, from the 3rd week of September onward, called it the drying line, a series of small raised wooden platforms set into the back wall of every 4th bay along the brigade front, with a roof of corrugated iron sheeting, a brazier under the platform, and a slatted rack above the brazier on which dry socks and dry footcloths were rotated through on a 6-hour drying cycle. 2 men at a time, by section roster, came off the firing line, sat on the platform, took their boots off, rubbed their feet dry on a square of clean hessian, put on the dry pair from the rack, and went back up. The brazier was, by Beasley's particular insistence, fed from a separate kindling store that did not, and this required an arrangement with the company quartermaster sergeant that I will not describe in detail, because the arrangement was not, in the formal sense, sanctioned, touch the company ration cooker's coal supply. The full system, drainage and drying line together, was in place along the whole 900 yards of the brigade front by the 20th of September. The evacuation rate for the 1/4 Loyal North Lancashire for the week ending the 24th of September was, by the medical officer's monthly return, 1 2/10 in 100, which was, by some distance, the lowest figure for a battalion in the Ypres salient that month, and which a clerical sergeant at the divisional ADMS's office, with the careful sarcasm of a man who has spent the war copying medical statistics by hand, ringed in red ink on the carbon, and wrote in the margin, "QED, evidently." I have, in writing this, made one further small omission that I want to correct, because the omission is the sort of thing that, if you let it pass, the schoolbook story passes too. The omission is this. Beasley did not, in any honest reading, design the drying line from scratch on the afternoon of the 4th of September. He had seen something very like it in the autumn of 1916, in a dugout in a sector held briefly by a French territorial regiment whose number I have not, in any of my notes, written down clearly enough to give in print, where a French sergeant of the regimental engineers, whose name I do not know, had set up a similar small platform with a brazier and a sock rack, and had explained the principle through an interpreter to a passing British sergeant who had stopped for 10 minutes to look. Beasley had stopped for 10 minutes to look. He had drawn nothing down. He had thanked the French sergeant in his bad school French and gone on. And 11 months later, in the bay off the duckboard track at Freysenberg, with Holdsworth's grey foot in front of him on the fire step, the French sergeant's platform came back to him. A great deal of the engineering of the trench war, in any honest telling, was like that. The work of one man crossed the line at 3:45 in the afternoon and turned up in the hands of another man, a year later, in a different uniform, in a different part of the line, when the conditions were right for it. The Beasley line was an English line. The drying platform behind it was, in any honest accounting, half French. I have, in the years since I first read the war diary entries, tried to find the name of the French sergeant. I have not been able to. The territorial regimental records at the Service Historique de la Défense at Vincennes are voluminous, and not, on the question of regimental sappers, well indexed, and the British liaison records for that sector and period are incomplete. I would, if any viewer happens to know more, be grateful to hear from them. For now, on the evening of the 7th of September 1917, Beasley sat in the dugout at the head of Beasley's Path and drew, in the back of the field message book, the cross-section of the drying platform. The brazier at the bottom, the slatted rack above, the small flue running up through the corrugated iron roof, the offset bench with its Hessian footcloth pegged at the side. He drew it the way he had drawn the stepped sump on the 2nd of August. He wrote, beside it, in the small, clean Edwardian hand he had inherited from William Topham, "Dry the man, not just the line." Then he closed the book. He went out into the rain. He walked north along the duckboard track in the failing light, and the track did not float under his boots. The full system was about to receive, 3 weeks later, the heaviest test that the Salient of 1917 was going to give it. The October storm of 1917 came down on the Ypres salient on the night of the 3rd, in a way that the official history would later describe, in the dry sentences of a regimental officer with no inclination to dramatize, as the wettest the salient had seen since the war began. The barometric pressure at the meteorological station of the Second Army at Kassel fell, in the 18 hours between the morning of the 3rd and the small hours of the 4th, by 23 millibars, which was the steepest single-day drop recorded at that station between 1916 and 1918. The wind came across the flats from the northwest at 30 miles an hour, gusting to 45, and it brought with it a rain that, by dawn on the 4th, was falling at a measured rate of 7/10 of an inch per hour, and would, by the evening of the 5th, have laid down 4 full inches of water across a brigade front already saturated to a depth of 19 inches from the previous week. The 4th Loyal North Lancashire had been in the line for 10 days when the storm hit. They were due to be relieved by the 5th Lancashire Fusiliers on the night of the 5th. The relief did not happen on time. The Fusilier carrying party, 68 men with rifles and small packs, on the standard reinforcement march from brigade transport, was caught on the duckboard track to the north of Mousetrap by a single 5-9 that fell at 20 past 10 on the night of the 4th and burst the track for 40 yards. The carrying party went to ground in the bays. They lay there for 11 hours in standing water that was, on most of the brigade line, knee-deep and rising. The relief was put back to the 7th. For the men of the 1st 4th, that meant 12 days in the line instead of 10. For the duckboard track called Beasley's Path, it meant the longest test the line had been given. Beasley sat the storm out in the head dugout. He had been there, at brigade's request, since the afternoon of the 3rd. The reason for the request, which had come down in writing from the divisional engineer, a lieutenant colonel by the name of Pierce Smith, whom Beasley had never met and would not, in the war, ever meet, was that the divisional staff wished, in the event of a major flood, to have a sapper fitter on the brigade line with the authority to order emergency repairs without waiting on a chit from brigade. The chit from brigade in the 2nd Army area in the autumn of 1917 took, on a quiet night, 4 hours to arrive. On a noisy night, it did not arrive at all. The divisional engineer's decision, which I have read in the divisional engineer's diary at Kew, in a quiet pencil annotation on the foot of the entry for the 2nd of October, was, in his own words, to put a man on the spot who knows the line and to trust him. The man on the spot, accordingly, was Sergeant Beasley. He had Wilkinson with him in the dugout, and 4 working party men, and a stockpile of 50 replacement duckboards, 60 sandbags, half a yard of the remaining Vlamertinger filter gravel. The second consignment from the brigade transport had been promised for the morning of the 5th and had not arrived, and a hurricane lamp. The dugout was 8 feet by 6. The men slept in shifts. Wilkinson slept first. I should say, because the temptation in writing about this kind of work is to make it look heroic, when in fact it was, in the way of all such work, mostly waiting and watching, that Beasley did not do anything dramatic on the night of the 4th or the morning of the 5th. He walked the line twice. He measured, against the chalk line on the heel of his right boot, the depth of water in the bays, knee-deep, rising at 1.5 inches an hour on the firing line, holding nearly steady on the support line, and the depth of water on the duckboard track itself, which was, between the support junction and the 11th sump, less than half an inch. The track was holding. The track was holding because the stepped sumps were doing exactly what William Topham had told Beasley in 1908 that they would do under load. They were slowing the water down. They were dropping the silt out of it. They were sending the cleaned water down the line through the lateral overflows by gravity alone into the Parados Channel and out into the old Shell Crater Pond, which was, by the morning of the 5th, 2 feet higher than it had been on the 3rd and rising, but holding. Wilkinson, on his second walk along the line in the small hours of the 5th, found the 18th sump partly blocked. The blockage was not silt. The blockage was a length of German signal cable, black gutta-percha, half an inch thick, of the kind the German Pioneer had been running through the Salient for 2 years, and pieces of which were regularly washed up in odd places by heavy rain, that had jammed itself across the lateral pipe. Wilkinson lifted the lid, pulled the cable out by hand, restacked the gravel, replaced the lid, and walked on. The sump cleared in under 3 minutes. The line continued to run. The line continued to run, with one further short blockage on the 24th sump that Wilkinson cleared at 5:30 in the morning, throughout the night of the 4th, throughout the day of the 5th, throughout the night of the 5th, and throughout the morning of the 6th. By the afternoon of the 6th, with the wind beginning at last to drop and the rain reduced to a thin grey drizzle, Wilkinson and Beasley walked the full 900 yards of the line together, in silence, and counted 23 points along it, at which the surface of the duckboard had carried less than an inch of running water through the worst of the storm. There were no points at which the duckboard had been submerged. There were no points at which a man walking the line would have had his boots take in water through the boot tops. 1.5 miles to the south, on the brigade transport track behind Frasenburg, which had been laid in March 1917 at the regulation 1 in 200 gradient with no sumps, the standing water on the morning of the 6th was up to a working man's thigh. The brigade transport on the 5th and the 6th had been done, in consequence, by stretcher carry rather than by truck. The 2nd, 5th Lancashire Fusiliers came up at last on the night of the 7th. They came up Beasley's path. They came up in their own boots, on a dry duckboard, and the men of the 4th went down past them in single file, also on the dry duckboard, and the two parties exchanged the standard, quiet sentences that fighting men exchange at a relief. and neither party, I think, much remarked on the dryness of the track, because the dryness of the track had become, in the 6 weeks since Beasley had laid the first sump, the condition you walked on without thinking about it. Which was, and I have come, over the years, to believe this is the truest sentence anybody could write about Beasley's work, the deepest form of compliment a sapper's line ever receives. The morning foot inspection of the 4th, Loyal North Lancashire, at the brigade rest billets at Flammertinga on the 8th of October, showed 3 cases of mild trench foot from the 12 days in line. 3 cases in a battalion of, on that morning, 671 effectives. 5 in 1,000. The medical officer's note in the margin of the return, in the careful copper plate that the divisional ADMS's office insisted on, read, "Lowest figure for any line battalion, this brigade, since the division was reformed in France." The note went up to brigade. Brigade sent it on to division. The divisional ADMs read it. The divisional engineer read it. The divisional engineer's office, in the entry for the 11th of October, recommended Sergeant J.F. Beasley of the Royal Engineers Field Company attached to the brigade for the military medal. The citation, and I have a copy of the original citation on its yellowed quarto sheet in front of me as I write this, taken from the regimental archive at Chatham, said only this: "For sustained engineering work of high quality, under conditions of severe weather and continuous enemy artillery action, resulting in a substantial and verifiable reduction in casualty evacuation among adjacent infantry. The drainage scheme designed and installed under his supervision and the supplementary foot care arrangements developed at his initiative have set a standard for field engineering practice in the 2nd Army area which is being adopted at the corps level." The citation was, by the standards of military medal citations in 1917, generous. It did not, however, name Beasley's path. It did not name the sumps. It did not name the drying line. It did not, in particular, name Albert Crouch, whose feet had been the reason Beasley walked the line on the 2nd of August, and whose mother had written the letter in Bootle that had reached the support trench on the 12th. The medal was gazetted on the 2nd of February 1918. Beasley received it from the Brigadier General at a regimental parade in a field outside Bailleul on the 11th of March. Edith was not there. The journey from Liverpool to Bailleul was in the spring of 1918, not a journey that the wives of sergeants made. He was, or rather by the time of the parade he had been transferred to, one of the tunnelling companies further south on the British line. The reason for the transfer was that a divisional engineer down on that front had read the December 1917 Royal Engineers Journal note about the drainage method recently observed in the 2nd Army area and had asked, through corps, for the sergeant responsible. The transfer was put in train in late January. Beasley arrived at the company's headquarters in mid-February. He spent the rest of the war working on tunnelled, deep-mined dugout drainage on a quieter stretch of the front, and after the German spring offensive, on temporary works on the Lys and the Aisne. He did not, in any of his post-Ypres work, encounter conditions as bad as the Salient in October 1917. He did not, in any of his post-Ypres work, lose another good man's feet to the wet. That part, the not losing of another man's feet, was the part that Beasley counted. I should say something now about the 1/4 Loyal North Lancashire and their later war, because the storyline of the duckboard track is not, in any honest sense, separable from the storyline of the battalion that walked on it. The 1st 4th were in the line at Ypres until the 20th of October. They were rotated out to Corps Reserve for 10 days, then back up to the Passchendaele front on the 3rd of November, by which time the ridge had been taken by the Canadians and the salient had moved forward 1.5 miles, and the duckboard tracks at Fresenberg were behind the new front line. They held a sector at Reutel through the rest of November and into the first week of December. The evacuation rates for trench foot in the battalion through that period stayed, by the medical officer's monthly returns, below 2 in 100 per week. The drying line and the stepped sumps were used by every working party that maintained a piece of the brigade front. The 1st 8th King's Liverpool, the 1st 4th King's Own, and the 2nd 5th Lancashire Fusiliers, all three of the other line battalions of the brigade, had by the end of November installed their own versions of the system on their own stretches of communication trench. The brigade was rotated out of the salient in mid-December. The 1 quarter went back to the line for the spring of 1918 at the Somme sector, and then, after the German spring offensive broke the line on the 21st of March, they were caught up in the long retreat to Amiens. They lost, and I am taking this number from the regimental history, which I have on the shelf behind me as I write, 411 officers and men in the 8 days from the 21st to the 29th of March. They were taken out of line at Amiens to refit, and went back in on the Lys in April, and held a line at Bailleul through the German Georgette offensive, and were finally pulled into Corps Reserve in the 2nd week of May. They went back to the line in August for the 100 days. They were in Mons on the morning of the 11th of November. I have, in 3 trips to the Lancashire Infantry Museum, gone through the surviving company nominal rolls for the 1st 4th Loyal North Lancashire for the period August 1917 to November 1918. I have looked for Holdsworth, the Burnley man with the broken front tooth. He survived. He was discharged in February 1919 with the use of both feet and went back to Burnley and worked as a foreman at a cotton mill until his retirement in 1955. He died in 1968 at the age of 73. He is buried in the Burnley Municipal Cemetery. I have looked for Wilkinson, the Preston cabinet maker. He was killed by machine gun fire at the crossing of the Selle on the 17th of October 1918, 25 days before the armistice. He is buried at the Highland Cemetery, Le Cateau. His grave is in Plot 2, Row C, number 14. There is a small inscription, paid for by his widow, which reads, "He made joints that did not show." I have stood in front of the headstone. I have not, in 20 years of going to that part of the line, ever stood in front of any headstone for any man for which I could think of a better inscription. But I have not said this to his widow's grandchildren, who I have met, because I do not think they need to hear it from a stranger. I have looked for Major Cawthorne. He survived the war. He went back into the Lancashire quarrying trade and was managing director of a slate quarry near Kirkby Lonsdale until 1934. He died of pneumonia in 1937. I have looked for Captain Henderson, the sandy-eyebrowed RAMC officer who had given Beasley the gravel chit on the afternoon of the 2nd of August. He survived the war. He returned to general practice in Stirling. He died in 1952 at the age of 71. I have looked for Captain Halliwell, the Bolton solicitor. He survived the war. He went back to his Bolton legal practice in 1919 and was a senior partner there until 1948. He died in 1957. I have looked also for Albert Crouch. Mrs. Mary Crouch's letter of October 1917 to Sergeant Beasley, the one that said, "He has not got his feet now. God bless you, Mary Crouch," was, the IWM file indicates, the last communication between the Crouch family and the Regimental Records Office on the subject of Albert's case until 1923. The 1923 entry, made in a different hand, is the formal application by Mrs. Crouch for the increase in her son's pension under the revised royal warrant of June of that year. The application was approved. The pension for a private soldier discharged with the loss of both feet was, as of July 1923, 27 shillings and sixpence per week. Albert Crouch lived with his mother at 17 Stanley Road, Bootle, until her death in February 1934. He kept a small shop on Stanley Road, selling tobacco and newspapers from 1925 onward. He used a hand-built wooden trolley with rubber-tired wheels, built for him, free of charge, by a neighbour who had been a coach builder at the Liverpool tram depot before the war, to move between the shop and the back room and the kitchen. He could not, after 1917, walk. He died in March 1953 of pneumonia at the age of 54. He was buried in the cemetery at Bootle, alongside his mother and his uncle Stephen, the Huskisson dock corporal who had been killed at Ginchy in 1916. His tunic, the same tunic in which he had carried his mother's letter through the Salient in 1917, was kept by the family in a cedar trunk in the upstairs bedroom of the Stanley Road house until the house was demolished in the slum clearances of 1964. The Crouch family, by then represented by Albert's nephew Robert, a docker's son who had been a sergeant in the King's Own Royal Border Regiment during the Second War, deposited the tunic and the letter and the small photograph of the black and white terrier with the Imperial War Museum in the autumn of that year. They are in the documents collection at Lambeth. I have held the tunic. The letter is in a small archival sleeve. The photograph is in a separate sleeve. They are, as the curator told me when I first visited, exactly as they came in. I have not said anything yet about Beasley after the armistice, because I wanted to say everything else first. He went back to Liverpool in February 1919. He went back to Toxteth. He went back to the Manchester Corporation Drainage Department, which, by 1919, was operating under a new joint arrangement with the Liverpool Corporation, and was, in administrative terms, no longer quite the same department, and he took back his place on the 8-shilling-a-day list. He worked as a sapper fitter for Liverpool Municipal Drainage until 1936. He was made foreman of the Toxteth sub-district in that year. He retired in 1949 at the age of 61. Edith died in 1953. They had no children. The reason for that, which I will not press because it is not my business, and was not at the time anybody's business but theirs, may have had to do with a particular illness Edith had in the winter of 1923, or it may have had to do with other things. The medical record is not available to me, and I would not have looked at it if it had been. Beasley himself died in 1968 at the age of 80. He had given, the year before he died, an interview to a young historian from Liverpool University by the name of Margaret Sutherland, who was researching a doctoral thesis on labour and the First World War. The interview was, by the standards of the genre, long. 3 afternoons in a small bungalow on the Wirral, with Beasley sitting in his armchair beside a coal fire and Mrs. Sutherland writing in a stenographer's notebook on her knee. And the thesis was published in 1972 under the title Skill, Class and the Western Front. I read the thesis in the British Library in 1989. I read it again in the original notebook form after I had tracked down Mrs. Sutherland's papers at the Liverpool Records Office in 2014. The notebook entries for the second afternoon, sometime in the 3rd week of April 1967, contain the following passage, which I will quote without comment because the comment, in this case, would be in the way. I asked him about the medal. He said it was in a drawer. He said his wife had kept it in a small wooden box that her father had carved for her in Toxteth in 1888, and that the box was on the shelf above the wireless. I asked if I could see it. He said he would prefer not to take it out. I asked him about the work. He said the work had been a good piece of work and that he was glad he had done it. I asked if he thought about the war often. He said no, not often, but he thought about a Bootle boy whose feet had gone. I asked about the boy. He said the boy had not been his to keep. He said this in the way of a man who had decided, a long time ago, that he was going to say it that way and that he was not going to say it any other way. I did not press him. The notebook entry ends there. The next entry is for the third afternoon, 2 days later, and concerns a different subject. I have, in the years since 2014, returned to that page of the notebook several times. I have not, on any of those returns, found anything else to say about it. The page is, in the end, the page. What remains of Beasley's path itself is, by the standards of the Ypres Salient, not a great deal. The duckboards rotted into the Flanders clay by 1922. Norwegian pine of that grade does not, in standing water, last beyond 5 seasons, and the fascines underneath them went to mulch by 1925. The sumps lasted longer. The sandbag linings rotted off by 1923, but the gravel beds remained, and the stones with which Wilkinson had reinforced the lower chambers on the wettest part of the line are, in some places, almost certainly still where he put them. I have stood on the field that was the Frasenberg sector in May 2009 and again in October 2012 with the Belgian battlefield archaeologist I mentioned earlier, and we have, on 3 of those visits, walked a line of what may be 3 of the original sumps. The line falls, with reasonable accuracy, 1 inch in 100 over its visible length. The archaeologist's view, which he gave me cautiously over coffee in a Zonnebecker cafe, was that the alignment is too consistent to be accidental, and that what we were walking was, in his careful French English, probably the work of a real engineer. The field belongs to a family who farm it for beet and for winter wheat. They have agreed to leave the sumps undisturbed when they plough, which they do, twice a year, in long, careful curves that run around the 3 points my archaeologist friend has marked. The family has been farming that ground for 4 generations. The current head of the household is a woman in her 60s named Inga, I will not give the surname, whose grandfather farmed the same field after the war, and who knows perfectly well that the small irregularities in her topsoil are the remains of something built by an Englishman in 1917. She is, in her own description, not unfriendly to the dead. I have eaten dinner at her kitchen table. The table is laid against a wall of her farmhouse that was, in 1917, the back wall of the dressing station at Mousetrap. The wall is the same wall. The stones are the same stones. The plaster has been repaired, in patches, over the 4 generations, but the run of the wall has not been altered. I will end with one further detail, because the detail closes the circle of the story. In May 1918, that is, 6 months after the gazetting of Beasley's medal, and 3 months after he had been transferred to the 254th Tunnelling Company, and well after Beasley himself had stopped having anything to do with the day-to-day running of the line at Frasenberg, a new commanding officer was posted to the brigade front in the Salient. The Salient by then was held by a different division, and the line at Frasenberg had been reorganized twice. The new CO